10-year-old cold cases that were solved by cigarettes. Welcome back to Creepshow, your home for the darkest tales and true crime mysteries that send shivers down your spine. Today, we unravel the haunting stories of 10 cold cases that were finally cracked wide open thanks to one overlooked detail: cigarettes. Grab your flashlight and settle in, because these cases prove that even the smallest clue can unravel decades of mystery and bring justice to those who thought they'd escaped it forever. Even in cases when there is an abundance of evidence, such as composite sketches of a suspect, eyewitness testimony, or the killer's DNA, crimes can remain unresolved for years, leaving bereaved families with unanswered questions and no sense of closure. More and more cold cases are being solved thanks to advances in forensics and technology, such as the CODIS database, which enables law enforcement and laboratories to gather and share information about convicted criminals, and forensic genealogy, which uses DNA recovered from a crime to trace and create a family tree for the suspect. But even with these developments, there is no assurance that a criminal will be apprehended, especially if they are able to avoid being sampled for DNA. Thankfully, it was enough to finally break open these 10 cold cases when the murderers in these cases threw away their cigarette butts with carelessness. Number 10. Patricia Barnes. Patricia Barnes, a 61-year-old homeless lady, was found dead in a ditch in Seattle, Washington in August 1995. She had been shot twice in the head and was found naked. There were no leads in the case, even after over 100 pieces of evidence were gathered from the scene, and a witness gave sketch artists information about a suspect. In an attempt to find the killer's family, Barnes's case was revived in 2018, and the material was forwarded to forensic genealogy-focused crime labs in Washington, Texas, and Florida. One of the labs found the suspect's relative in 2021 and subsequently gave the police Douglas Keith Crone's identity. At the time of Barnes's death, Crone was a local of the Seattle region and had a criminal past that included kidnapping and robbery. But Crone passed away in 2016 as a result of an unintentional electrocution. Once a name was known, investigators could compare the DNA from their evidence, specifically the cigarette butts, with a sample of blood obtained during Crone's autopsy, proving that he was the one who killed Barnes. Barnes's killer was identified, and her family was finally able to find closure after almost 30 years. Number 9. Paul Aikman. Paul Aikman, 35, was fatally murdered in an Oklahoma rest area in 1985. Police were unable to identify any potential suspects, despite the fact that both fingerprints and cigarette butts were gathered as evidence in the case. When the DNA from the cigarette butts was connected to Earl Wayne Wilson in 2019 through an impromptu check of the National DNA Database, CODIS, detectives had a breakthrough in their investigation. Wilson had already been incarcerated in Oklahoma at the time for the sexual assault of a lady who was 20 years old. Wilson initially denied any involvement in the murder of Aikman, but in 2021 he entered a guilty plea in exchange for a lesser charge. Wilson was given a 20-year prison sentence. Number 8. Tonya McKinley. In an attempt to celebrate the approaching year 1985, 23-year-old Tonya McKinley went to Daryl's Bar and Grill in Pensacola, Florida, but she never came home to her 18-month-old son. On January 1, 1985, she was sexually raped and strangled to death. Her body was discovered half naked. Although McKinley's friends and relatives, as well as people who had visited the restaurant, were questioned by the police, no suspects were ever discovered. However, investigators were able to use the DNA from bodily fluids left behind to establish a family tree that would lead them to McKinley's killer, Daniel Wells, thanks to technological advancements and the abundance of online laboratories that test DNA for persons trying to identify long-lost family members. Police were able to trace Wells once they got his name, and when he threw his cigarette butt out the window, they had enough evidence to match his DNA and haul him into custody for McKinley's murder. On March 18, 2020, Wells was taken into custody and accused of first-degree murder and sexual battery. However, Wells committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell prior to McKinley's family receiving any official justice. Number 7. Roxanne Woods. On February 20th, 1987, Roxanne Woods and her spouse Terry went bowling together in the evening, but they returned home by car. When Terry got home, he discovered his wife dead in their kitchen, her throat slit, but Roxanne had left before him. Patrick Gillum was a man that the police felt was involved, but they never got hard proof. Although Woods's case was reopened by police in 2001, no further progress was achieved, and the break they were seeking for in the case wouldn't come until 2021. A credible tip led investigators to believe that Gillum was a potential suspect. He didn't have any DNA in the CODIS database, despite having resided in the area and having been found guilty of rape in 1979. Then, the police brought in MSP forensic laboratories to handle the analysis of the previously gathered evidence. However, because the DNA was so old, a large portion of it had decayed. But they were able to connect the DNA taken the night of Wood's murder to a cigarette butt Gillum threw out while he was being watched, thanks to a combination of their sample and genealogical reconstruction. Gillum was given a 23-year prison sentence after being apprehended on February 17, 2022. Number 6. Michael Lee. On October 21, 1980, 29-year-old Michael Lee, an iron worker from Indiana, was found shot in the head while on vacation in Arizona. Police never succeeded in identifying Lee's killers, despite taking cigarette butts and other objects as evidence. To create a strong lead, the Yavapai Sheriff's Office revived the case in June 2018 and sent the cigarette butts out for testing. David Ellsworth Widmer was identified based on the findings of the DNA test. After the DNA results were confirmed and the investigators carried out more research, they also learned that Widmer intended to rob Lee, as did his accomplice Rocky Crabtree, both of whom had a long criminal history. But when they couldn't find Lee's money, they shot him instead. Even though Widmer and Crabtree passed away before this information was made public, Lee's family was relieved to have answers at last. Number 5. Marilyn Hickey. A cab driver dropped off Marilyn Hickey at her apartment in Bremerton, Washington on September 9, 1992, along with an unidentified male. She would never be seen again, not by anyone other than this. She was later discovered in her residence, strangled. Although they were able to find a piece of paper bearing Lee Miller's name in Hickey's purse, the police were never able to find him. But in 2006, while pursuing a different cold case, Boise, Idaho police officials learned that the DNA evidence they were analyzing matched that of Hickey's killer. At this point, the Boise police also received the name Lee Miller, so they started monitoring Lee and cross-referencing records. They were able to prove he was the murderer in both cases by obtaining a cigarette butt he had placed outside his house. After entering a guilty plea to killing Hickey, Lee was given a 17-year jail sentence for second-degree murder. In addition, he entered a guilty plea to the Boise homicide of 49-year-old Cheryl Barrett, for which he received a further 25 years behind bars. Number 4. Jerri Ann Jones. When Jerri Ann Jones was kidnapped in July 1987, she was just 19 years old and waiting for a ride outside her workplace, the Harris Teeter supermarket in Charlotte, North Carolina. President Robert Goodale of Harris Teeter even offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who could identify the killer in the hopes that someone would come forward. But no fresh proof surfaced. The Charlotte Cold Case Squad was founded in 2003 with the goal of utilizing forensics and technological developments to solve historical cases. After being added to the CODIS database, cigarette butts and semen samples from Jones's case matched Terry Alvin Hyatt's DNA. Fortunately, they knew exactly where he was. At the time, Hyatt had previously killed 2 other women and was already on death row. On August 2, 2005, Hyatt entered a guilty plea and was given a life sentence. Number 3. Anita Piteau. In the 1960s, Anita Piteau moved from her main home to pursue her dream of becoming a movie star. On March 14, 1968, nevertheless, her body was discovered with a slit throat, having been raped and battered. Piteau's case was made even more unsettling by the fact that neither she nor her perpetrator would be found for the next 52 years. In an attempt to identify the Jane Doe, police disseminated pictures of her and gathered jewelry, clothing, and cigarette butts from the area. Still, there were no leads from the sketches or the evidence. Then, in 2019, authorities identified the murderer, Johnny Crisco, who passed away from cancer in 2015, using the DNA from the cigarette butt discovered and family history research. 2020 saw the police acquire the assistance of forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. By using Piteau's DNA, she was able to locate a relative who was still residing in Maine. Jane Doe was eventually recognized after 52 long years, and her remains were returned to her family in Maine. Number 2. Angie Dodge. After moving into her first apartment in Idaho Falls in late 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was discovered battered, sexually assaulted, and her throat so severely cut that she almost lost her head. Christopher Tapp admitted to killing Dodge in 1997, but he didn't come clean until police threatened to execute him if he didn't come clean. Even though Tapp's DNA wasn't found at the site, and he later withdrew his confession because of the situation, he was imprisoned for 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. Dodge's case remained a cold case even after he was convicted guilty, since the real killer had never been located. For the following 20 years, Dodge's mother Carol persisted in her efforts to clear Tapp of her daughter's murder and find the perpetrator. Ultimately, Tapp was made available in 2017 thanks to the work of Carol and the Innocence Project. Investigators started looking through public genealogical databases in 2019 and collaborated with C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist at Parabon Laboratories, who was able to construct a family tree using the DNA that was gathered. They were able to track down Brian Drips, a suspect who lived across the street from Angie at the time of her murder, thanks to this procedure. In the beginning of the investigation, he was also questioned. As Drips threw away his cigarette butts, police started to follow him and gather them. Upon obtaining more samples, they sent them for analysis, and the results showed a positive match to the DNA they had discovered on Dodge. After being taken into custody, Drip admitted his guilt, saying he had been on narcotics at the time and had no intention of killing Dodge. June 8, 2021 saw his sentencing to life in prison. Number 1. Sarah Yarborough. In December 1991, 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough was en route to school in anticipation of a drill team event. Later that morning, her body, which had been assaulted and strangled to death, was discovered close to her high school in Washington. Police used the assistance of local witnesses to draw sketches of the suspected murderer. Police routinely checked DNA databases for the next 20 years in the hopes of finding a connection, but the case appeared to be dead on arrival. However, a suspect, Patrick Nicholas, was eventually identified in 2019 with the use of forensic genealogy research. Nicholas was previously found guilty of rape in 1983, but as the CODIS was not then in place, no law enforcement agency was aware of his conviction. He was again detained in 1993 on suspicion of child molestation, but the charges were ultimately reduced to a misdemeanor, sparing him from having to submit his DNA. Detectives saw that Nicholas was acting strangely, so they started to follow him closely. After that, they found some butt cigarettes and a napkin he had abandoned outside of a nearby strip mall. Those objects' DNA matched samples taken in 1991. In October 2019, Nicholas was taken into custody and is currently awaiting trial. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through some of the most perplexing cold cases finally solved by a single crucial mistake. Remember, no matter how much time passes, justice has a way of finding the truth. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Creepshow, and ring the bell so you never miss an update on the most spine-tingling tales. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you next time in the shadows.